I remember the exact moment everything changed between us, though I couldn't have known it then. It was a Tuesday evening in late October, the kind where the air carries that sharp bite of approaching winter, and the streetlights outside my apartment window cast everything in amber. I was standing in my doorway, keys still warm in my palm from locking up, watching Nolan Reyes, my best friend since sophomore year of college, slip one of my hoodies over his head. The hoodie was gray, faded from too many washes, with a small hole near the left shoulder that I'd never bothered to mend. On me, it fit loose and comfortable, the way I preferred my clothes. On Nolan, it was different. The sleeves hung past his hands, making him tuck his fingers into the cuffs like a child. The drawstrings brushed against his jawline when he moved, and the fabric pooled slightly around his waist where his frame was narrower than mine. He'd asked to borrow it without ceremony, the way he'd borrowed my books and my car and my time for years. We'd been sitting on my couch, splitting a pizza and half watching some documentary about ocean currents that neither of us was really following, when he mentioned being cold. I gestured toward the closet without thinking, told him to grab whatever he wanted. It was such an ordinary moment that I almost didn't look up from my phone when he stood. But something made me glance over. Maybe it was the way he moved, slower than usual, his fingers trailing along the fabric as he pulled it from the hanger. Maybe it was the care he took in putting it on, smoothing the shoulders, adjusting the hood. I watched him without understanding why I was watching. The way you might notice a bird outside your window and find yourself following its movements for no reason you can name. When he turned back to face me, something had shifted in his expression. The easy smile he usually wore had softened into something more tentative, more private. He pulled the fabric close to his chest with both hands, the way you might hold a blanket on a cold morning when you don't want to get out of bed. Then he said it, so quietly I might have missed it if the apartment hadn't been perfectly still. "It smells like you. I'm keeping it." I laughed because that's what I always did when Nolan said something that caught me off guard. It was a nervous sound, higher than my usual laugh, and even as it left my mouth, I knew it sounded wrong. I was used to Nolan joking around, used to the easy physical closeness we'd always shared, his arms slung over my shoulders during movies, his habit of stealing food from my plate, the way he'd crash on my couch when his roommates were being too loud. But this felt different. It was the way he said it. Not with the teasing grin I expected, not with the mock-dramatic flair he used when he was being ridiculous on purpose. His voice was soft, almost careful, and his eyes didn't leave mine when he spoke. There was no punchline coming, no moment where he'd break character and we'd both laugh at the absurdity of it. He meant it, whatever it was he was really saying. My chest did something strange then, a tightening that started near my heart and spread outward like ink and water. It was a feeling I'd spent years learning not to recognize, not to name, not to acknowledge even in the privacy of my own thoughts. Because Nolan was my best friend, and he was straight, and I was the kind of person who valued stability over risk, certainty over possibility. I managed something that probably counted as a response. I told him he'd better take good care of it, or that he'd have to buy me a replacement, some throwaway comment that let us both pretend the moment was lighter than it felt. He smiled then, that familiar crooked smile that had gotten him out of trouble since I'd known him. But there was something underneath it I couldn't read. The rest of the evening passed normally enough. We finished the documentary, argued half-heartedly about whether the ending was optimistic or depressing, cleaned up the empty pizza box and beer bottles. When he left around 11, he was still wearing the hoodie, and I found myself watching from my window as he walked to his car, the gray fabric visible even in the dim street light. I stood there longer than I should have, even after his taillights disappeared around the corner. The apartment felt different with him gone, quieter in a way that had nothing to do with sound. I found myself looking at the spot on the couch where he'd been sitting, the slight impression his weight had left in the cushions, the way the throw pillow was pushed to one side where he'd leaned against it. Hours later, I was lying in bed staring at the ceiling, replaying the moment over and over like a song stuck on repeat. The way his fingers had curled into the fabric. The way his voice had dropped when he said my name. Not Eli like he usually called me, but Elias, full and careful. The way he'd looked at me afterward, like he was waiting for something I didn't know how to give. I got up around 2 in the morning and walked to my closet, pulling the door open to look at the empty space where the hoodie used to hang. The wooden hanger swayed slightly in the disturbed air, and I found myself reaching out to touch it. as if I could somehow feel the absence of weight it no longer held. This was dangerous territory, I knew. This was the kind of thinking that had gotten me in trouble before, reading meaning into gestures that were probably innocent, hoping for things that would only complicate the most important friendship in my life. Nolan was warm with everyone, tactile and affectionate in a way that came naturally to him. He'd had girlfriends for as long as I'd known him, serious relationships that I'd helped him navigate, listened to him worry about, celebrated and mourned alongside him when they ended. But lying there in the dark, I couldn't stop thinking about the way he'd said it. It smells like you. Not like laundry detergent or cologne or any of the obvious things a piece of clothing might smell like. Like me, specifically. Like that was something worth keeping. I pressed my face into my pillow and tried to force myself towards sleep, but my mind kept circling back to that moment of stillness when he'd held the fabric against his chest. There had been something so tender about it, so deliberate. Like he was savoring something he didn't get to have very often. The rational part of my brain, the part that had kept me safe and careful for 28 years, insisted I was reading too much into it. Friends borrowed each other's clothes all the time. Friends said things that could be taken multiple ways. Friends stood a little too close sometimes, lingered a little too long in doorways, looked at each other with expressions that were hard to interpret. But the other part of me, the part one usually kept locked away, whispered that maybe this time was different. Maybe this time, the careful distance I'd maintained between us had shifted, just slightly, just enough to let something new and terrifying and wonderful slip through the cracks. I must have fallen asleep eventually, because the next thing I knew it was morning, gray light filtering through my bedroom curtains, and the sound of traffic beginning to build outside. But even as I made coffee and checked my emails and tried to settle into the familiar rhythm of my day, I couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental had changed, that the easy equilibrium Nolan and I had maintained for years had been disturbed, and I had no idea what would grow in its place. The hoodie was gone, but its absence felt like a presence, a question mark hanging in the space between us that I wasn't sure either of us was ready to answer. The next morning brought the illusion of normalcy. I made coffee in the same mug I always used, settled at my desk with my tablet and stylus, and tried to lose myself in the familiar rhythm of work. I was freelance illustrating then, mostly book covers and magazine layouts, the kind of quiet creative work that let me disappear into other people's stories instead of examining my own too closely. My apartment reflected this preference for solitude and control. It was small but carefully curated, filled with plants that thrived under my methodical care and the soft hum of lo-fi playlists that created just enough ambient noise to keep the silence from feeling oppressive. Everything had its place, from the books arranged by color on floating shelves to the vintage camera collection I'd inherited from my grandmother, displayed on a narrow console by the window. I was someone who measured words and steps, who thought before speaking, who preferred observation to participation. It was a way of being that had served me well through college and into my late 20s, keeping me safe from the kind of emotional turbulence that seemed to follow more impulsive people. Nolan used to tease me about it, calling me his steady friend, the one who never lost his keys or forgot appointments or made decisions he'd regret in the morning. Nolan Reyes was my opposite in almost every conceivable way. Where I was careful, he was spontaneous. Where I was quiet, he was effortlessly magnetic, the kind of person who could walk into a room full of strangers and leave with 3 new friends and an invitation to someone's birthday party. He had this way of leaning into conversations, into physical spaces, into people's lives, as if the concept of boundaries was something that applied to other people but not to him. We'd met during sophomore year of college, in a philosophy class neither of us had particularly wanted to take. I'd been sitting in the back, taking careful notes on Kant's categorical imperative, when this guy with unruly dark hair and paint-stained fingers had dropped into the seat beside me and asked if he could borrow a pen. That was Nolan, always needing something, always assuming it would be freely given, and somehow always being right about that assumption. Our friendship had grown slowly at first, built on shared study sessions and late-night conversations in the dining hall when neither of us wanted to go back to our respective dorms. But by senior year, we were inseparable in the way that only happens once or twice in a lifetime if you're lucky. He was the first person I called when something good happened, the first person I turned to when the world felt too heavy to carry alone. After graduation, when I'd moved to this city to start my illustration career, and he'd followed 6 months later to work at a nonprofit focused on urban housing development. It had felt natural to maintain that closeness. We lived 15 minutes apart, spoke on the phone almost daily, and had developed a comfortable routine of shared meals and impromptu hangouts that felt like the adult version of the friendship we'd built in college. The thing was, I'd been quietly in love with him for most of that time. Not the desperate, all-consuming kind of love that drives people to make grand gestures or ultimatums, but something quieter and more persistent. It lived in the space between my ribs, a low-grade ache that flared up at inconvenient moments, and then settled back into something manageable. I'd learned to carry it the way you might carry a minor injury, favoring it slightly, but not letting it stop you from moving forward. Nolan had never given me any reason to think he felt the same way. He dated women exclusively, had serious relationships that I helped him navigate with the careful neutrality of a good friend. When Sarah broke up with him junior year, I was the one who sat with him in his dorm room while he worked through his feelings. When he'd been nervous about meeting Jessica's parents, I was the one who helped him pick out clothes and practice conversation topics with him until he felt confident. I told myself this was enough, that friendship with him was better than the alternative of nothing at all. And most of the time, I almost believed it. But there had always been moments that made me wonder. The way he touched me casually, constantly, his hand on my shoulder when he laughed, his knee pressed against mine when we sat together on couches. The way our phone conversations stretched late into the night, covering everything from work frustrations to childhood memories to half-formed philosophical questions about the nature of happiness. The way he looked at me sometimes, with an attention that felt different from the way he looked at other people. More focused, more curious, like he was trying to solve a puzzle he couldn't quite name. I'd always assumed this was just who Nolan was with everyone, that his natural warmth and magnetism extended to all his friendships. He collected people the way I collected vintage cameras, drawn to interesting personalities and comfortable with the kind of emotional intimacy that made me nervous. It made sense that he would be tactile and affectionate, that he would blur the lines between friendship and something deeper without thinking about it. But lying in bed that night, replaying the way he'd said it smells like you, I found myself questioning all those assumptions. There had been something in his voice I'd never heard before, something vulnerable and uncertain that didn't match the confident, easygoing person I thought I knew. The rational part of my mind insisted this was dangerous thinking, the kind of hope that could destroy a friendship if I wasn't careful. But another part of me, smaller and more reckless, whispered that maybe I'd been wrong about him all along. Maybe the careful distance I'd maintained, the assumption that his feelings were purely platonic, had blinded me to possibilities I'd been too afraid to consider. As I sat at my desk that morning, trying to focus on the book cover illustration I was supposed to finish by Friday, I found myself checking my phone every few minutes, waiting for a text, a call, some sign that the previous evening had meant something to him too. But the screen remained dark, and eventually I forced myself to put it in a drawer and try to concentrate on work. It would be 3 days before I heard from him again. 3 days of carefully normal routine, punctuated by moments of wondering if I'd imagined the whole thing. 3 days of staring at that empty space in my closet and trying to convince myself it didn't matter. The first photo arrived on Thursday afternoon while I was working on a particularly stubborn illustration of a lighthouse. My phone buzzed against the desk, and I glanced over to see Nolan's name on the screen. The image loaded slowly, the way photos sometimes do when you're not expecting them. And when it finally appeared, I felt that same chest-tightening sensation I'd experienced 3 nights earlier. He was standing in what looked like his kitchen, morning light streaming through the window behind him, wearing my hoodie. The sleeves were still too long, still bunched around his wrists in that endearing way, and he was holding a cup of coffee with both hands. But it was his expression that caught me off guard. He wasn't smiling his usual broad grin or making one of the silly faces he typically put on for photos. Instead, he looked soft, almost shy, like he'd been caught in a private moment he hadn't intended to share. The text beneath the photo was simple, still warm, still keeping it. I stared at the message for longer than was probably normal, my stylus forgotten in my hand. There was something deliberate about the photo, something staged despite its casual appearance. The lighting was too good to be accidental, the angle too carefully chosen. He'd thought about this before sending it, Had maybe taken several versions before settling on this one. I typed and deleted half a dozen responses before settling on something I hoped sounded appropriately casual. Looks good on you. I finally sent, then immediately regretted it. Too direct. Too loaded with meaning he might not intend to hear. But his response came quickly. Better on me than in your closet gathering dust. Over the next few days, the photos became a pattern. Nolan at work, sleeves pushed up to his elbows, my hoodie draped over his office chair. Nolan at the grocery store, hood pulled up against an unexpected drizzle, texting me from the produce aisle about how soft the fabric was against his neck. Nolan on his couch, book in his lap, wearing my hoodie like armor against the world. Each image came with some small comment about the hoodie itself. How warm it was, how comfortable, how it smelled like my laundry detergent mixed with something distinctly me. I found myself saving each photo to my phone without quite admitting to myself why, studying them at odd moments throughout the day like they might reveal some hidden message I'd missed. The strangest part was how natural it seemed on him now, like it had always been his. In person, when we met for coffee or dinner, he wore it without self-consciousness, without the careful deliberation I'd noticed that first night. He'd pull at the sleeves when he was thinking, tug the hood up when the restaurant was too cold, adjust the drawstrings without seeming to realize he was doing it. But I noticed. I noticed everything. I noticed how his fingers lingered on the fabric when he thought I wasn't looking, the way he'd absently stroke the sleeve while we talked. I noticed how he'd lean closer to me on the couch during movies, close enough that I could smell my own detergent mixed with his cologne, close enough that our knees would press together in a contact that felt both accidental and entirely intentional. I noticed other things too, subtler changes in the rhythm of our friendship that might have been coincidence, but felt like something more. The way his touch seemed to linger now when we hugged goodbye, his hands staying on my shoulders a beat longer than necessary. The way he'd brush his fingers against mine when passing me drinks, a contact so brief it could have been accidental, but happened too often to dismiss. Most unsettling of all, I noticed how he responded when I mentioned dating. It came up casually one evening while we were splitting takeout from the Thai place down the street from my apartment. I'd been telling him about a guy I'd matched with on an app, someone who seemed promising enough for a coffee date, when I saw Nolan's expression shift. It was subtle, barely perceptible, but I'd known him long enough to catch the slight tightening around his eyes, the way his fingers stilled on the sleeve of my hoodie. "Oh," he said quietly, not looking up from his pad thai. "Guess I'm busy that night too." I hadn't even mentioned when the date was supposed to happen. The comment hung in the air between us, loaded with implications neither of us seemed ready to address directly. I found myself studying his face, looking for some sign that he realized what he'd just revealed, but he kept his attention focused on his food with unusual intensity. Later, after he'd gone home and I was cleaning up the empty containers, I kept replaying that moment. The careful neutrality in his voice, the way he'd tugged at my hoodie sleeve like it was a comfort object, the fact that he'd assumed some kind of claim on my time without seeming to realize he was doing it. This was new territory for us, this careful dance around something we couldn't name. For years, our friendship had been easy, uncomplicated by the kind of jealousy or possessiveness that might have made things messy. Nolan had been genuinely happy for me when I'd dated people, offering advice and support in the same way I'd done for him. But something had shifted, and the hoodie seemed to be both catalyst and symbol of that change. It was as if wearing my clothes had given him permission to blur boundaries he'd previously respected, to stake small claims he'd never felt entitled to make before. I found myself wondering if he understood what he was doing, if the possessiveness I was seeing was conscious or instinctual. Part of me wanted to ask him directly, to force the conversation we seemed to be avoiding. But another part of me was terrified of breaking whatever spell had settled over us, of pushing too hard and losing him entirely. So I waited, caught between hope and caution, watching him wear my clothes like they'd always belonged to him, and wondering what it meant that I was letting him. The weeks that followed felt like living inside a question I couldn't bring myself to ask. Nolan continued wearing my hoodie with an ownership that seemed to grow more natural each day, and I found myself caught between the desire to understand what it meant and the fear of disrupting whatever delicate balance we'd stumbled into. I started paying attention to details I'd never noticed before, or perhaps had trained myself not to see. The way Nolan's eyes would follow me when I moved around a room, tracking my movements with an intensity that felt different from casual friendship. The way he'd position himself during our movie nights, always finding reasons to sit close enough that some part of him was touching some part of me, knee against thigh, shoulder against shoulder, fingers brushing when we reached for the same bowl of popcorn. The hoodie had become a constant presence in these moments, and I began to suspect it was more than just a piece of clothing he'd grown attached to. When he wore it, he seemed more tactile, more inclined to breach the invisible boundaries that had always existed between us. He'd lean into me during funny scenes, rest his head against my shoulder during quiet moments, play with the drawstrings in a way that seemed absent-minded but felt charged with significance. "Still smells like you," he'd murmur sometimes, usually when he thought I wasn't paying attention, his voice soft and almost reverent. He'd pull the fabric close to his face, inhaling deeply, and I'd pretend I hadn't noticed while my heart did complicated things in my chest. The photographs continued too, arriving at random moments throughout my days like small gifts I hadn't asked for but found myself treasuring. Nolan in my hoodie at his office, looking serious as he reviewed housing proposals. Nolan in my hoodie at the coffee shop we both frequented, steam rising from his mug as he smiled at something on his phone. Nolan in my hoodie late at night, hair mussed from sleep, texting me that he couldn't fall asleep and wondering if I was still awake. I saved every single one, though I told myself it was just because they were good photos, because Nolan had always been naturally photogenic in a way that made even casual snapshots look intentional. But late at night, when I couldn't sleep, I'd find myself scrolling through them, studying his expressions, looking for clues to feelings he might not even recognize in himself. The shift in how he talked about my dating life became more pronounced as the days passed. Where he'd once been supportive, even encouraging, now there was an edge to his responses that I couldn't ignore. When I mentioned the coffee date I'd finally gone on with the guy from the app, Nolan's questions felt like interrogation disguised as friendly concern. "How was it?" he asked, fingers tugging at the sleeve of my hoodie in a gesture that was becoming familiar. "Did you have a good time? Do you think you'll see him again?" The date had been pleasant but unremarkable, the kind of polite conversation between two people who were checking boxes rather than discovering genuine connection. I told Nolan this, expecting him to offer the usual encouragement about giving things time, about second dates revealing more than first ones. Instead, he nodded with what looked suspiciously like relief. "Good," he said, then seemed to catch himself. "I mean, if there wasn't a spark, there's no point forcing it, right?" But it was the way he said good that stayed with me, the small smile that accompanied it, as if my romantic disappointment was somehow his victory. The pattern repeated itself over the following weeks. When I mentioned another potential date, Nolan would find subtle ways to discourage it. "The guy sounded boring," he'd say, or he'd point out incompatibilities I hadn't even considered. "You don't even like guys who wear too much cologne," he'd remind me about someone I'd barely described. "Why waste your time on someone who's probably going to annoy you?" The presumption in these comments should have bothered me more than it did. The implication that he knew my preferences better than I did, that he had some right to weigh in on my romantic choices with anything more than casual friend concern. But instead of irritation, what I felt was a dangerous flutter of hope. Because the subtext of his objections felt like jealousy, and jealousy implied feelings he hadn't admitted to having. I found myself testing this theory in small ways, mentioning attractive strangers I'd noticed, describing conversations with coworkers who'd expressed interest, watching for his reactions. And they were always there, subtle but unmistakable if you knew how to look. The slight tension in his shoulders, the way his fingers would find the fabric of my hoodie and worry at it, the careful neutrality in his voice that didn't quite mask the tightness underneath. One evening, as we sat on my couch sharing a bottle of wine and pretending to watch a documentary about Arctic wildlife, I decided to push a little harder. I mentioned that David from the coffee shop had asked for my number, describing him in terms I knew would sound appealing. "Artistic," I said. "Thoughtful. Good hands." Nolan went very still beside me, his wine glass suspended halfway to his lips. He was wearing my hoodie, as he always was now, the fabric soft and familiar in the lamplight. When he finally spoke, his voice was carefully controlled in a way that told me he was anything but calm. "Just make sure he treats you right," he said, not looking at me. "You deserve someone who appreciates you." The words themselves were kind, supportive in the way a good friend's words should be. But there was something underneath them, some current of emotion he wasn't quite managing to hide. It was in the way he held himself, rigid and careful, like he was afraid of what might happen if he relaxed. It was in the way his free hand had found the hem of my hoodie and was gripping it, knuckles white with tension. Most of all, it was in the way he said "you deserve someone," like he was trying to convince himself as much as me, like the words tasted bitter in his mouth. I found myself studying his profile in the flickering light from the television, taking in the sharp line of his jaw, the way his dark hair fell across his forehead, the familiar curve of his mouth that looked anything but relaxed in that moment. He was beautiful, had always been beautiful, but there was something different about him now, something vulnerable and uncertain that made him seem younger, more fragile than the confident person I'd known for years. The silence stretched between us, heavy with things neither of us seemed ready to say. On the screen, polar bears moved across endless white landscapes, but I wasn't watching them. I was watching Nolan, waiting for him to look at me, wondering what I'd see in his eyes if he did. When he finally turned, the expression on his face was complicated, layered with emotions I couldn't fully parse. But underneath it all was something that looked almost like longing, quickly hidden, but not quickly enough. That was the moment I began to suspect the hoodie was never really about the hoodie at all. The confrontation came on a rainy Thursday evening in November, almost 3 weeks after Nolan had first slipped my hoodie over his head. He'd arrived at my apartment earlier than usual, soaked from the sudden downpour that had caught him between his car and my front door. His hair was dark with rain, droplets clinging to his eyelashes, and he was clutching the front of my hoodie like it was the only thing keeping him warm. We'd settled into our usual routine, ordering Chinese takeout and queuing up a movie neither of us particularly cared about watching. But something felt different that night, charged in a way that made the familiar space of my living room seem smaller, more intimate. Maybe it was the sound of rain against the windows, creating a cocoon of privacy around us. Maybe it was the way the lamplight caught in Nolan's damp hair, or the way he kept pulling my hoodie tighter around himself like armor. Or maybe it was simply that I'd reached the limit of what I could endure without answers. He was sitting closer to me than usual on the couch, close enough that I could smell the rain in his hair mixed with the scent of my own laundry detergent on the fabric he wore. His fingers were playing with the drawstrings of the hoodie in that absent way that had become so familiar, and I found myself watching the small movements, hypnotized by the casual intimacy of it. The movie played in the background, something about a heist in Monaco that neither of us was following, but I wasn't thinking about elaborate robbery plots. I was thinking about the way Nolan's knee was pressed against mine, warm and solid, and how he hadn't moved away when I'd shifted closer under the pretense of reaching for my wine glass. I was thinking about 3 weeks of photographs and subtle touches and carefully worded comments about my dating life. 3 weeks of watching him wear my clothes like they belonged to him, a feeling like we were dancing around something neither of us had the courage to name. The breaking point came when my phone buzzed against the coffee table, lighting up with a text from David, the guy from the coffee shop who'd been persistently trying to arrange a second date. The message was visible on the lock screen, something about dinner plans for the weekend, and I watched Nolan's expression change as he read it. The shift was subtle but unmistakable. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, his fingers stilled on the drawstrings, and something that looked like pain flickered across his features before he could hide it. That was when the words came out of me, sudden and sharp, cutting through the careful politeness we'd been maintaining for weeks. "Why do you even want that hoodie so much?" I asked, my voice louder than I'd intended in the quiet room. "You could buy your own." The question hung in the air between us, loaded with all the frustration and confusion and desperate hope I'd been carrying. Nolan went very still beside me, his hand frozen where it had been toying with the fabric, his eyes fixed on the television screen as if the fate of the fictional heist was the most important thing in the world. For a moment, I thought he might deflect, might make a joke or change the subject the way he sometimes did when conversations ventured into territory that made him uncomfortable. But then he turned to look at me, and I saw something in his expression I'd never seen before. Vulnerability, raw and unguarded, like I'd caught him without his usual defenses. His voice, when he finally spoke, was barely above a whisper. "Because it's yours," he said, the words coming out careful and deliberate, like he was handling something fragile. "Because when I wear it, it feels like I'm closer to you. And maybe that's stupid, but I don't want to give it back. The admission hit me like a physical thing, stealing the breath from my lungs and making my heart race in a way that felt almost painful. This was what I'd been hoping for, what I'd been afraid to believe might be possible, but hearing it spoken aloud was somehow more overwhelming than I'd anticipated. The room felt impossibly quiet, the sound of rain against the windows suddenly thunderous in the silence that followed his words. Nolan was looking at me with an expression that was equal parts hope and terror, like he'd just stepped off a cliff and wasn't sure if he was falling or flying. I could see him processing what he'd just revealed, could watch the moment when the full weight of his admission settled over him. His eyes widened slightly, as if he was surprised by his own honesty, and I saw him start to pull back, to retreat into the safety of ambiguity. But I couldn't let him. Not now, when we were finally here, finally at the edge of the truth we'd been circling for weeks. The silence stretched between us, heavy with possibility and terror in equal measure. On the television, the fictional thieves were making their escape through the narrow streets of Monaco, but I wasn't watching them. I was watching Nolan, taking in every detail of his face in the lamplight, memorizing this moment when everything we'd been to each other was about to change forever. His fingers were still clutched in the fabric of my hoodie, knuckles white with tension, and I could see his chest rising and falling with careful, controlled breaths. He looked young in that moment, younger than his 29 years, stripped of the easy confidence that usually defined him. I knew that what I said next would determine everything, that we were balanced on the knife's edge between friendship and something more, between safety and risk, between the careful distance we'd maintained and the terrifying intimacy of absolute honesty. But looking at him sitting there in my clothes, wearing his heart on his sleeve for the first time since I'd known him, I realized there was only one response I could give. Only one truth that mattered in the face of his brave confession. The movie played on, forgotten, as I finally found the courage to step off the cliff with him. The moment stretched between us like a held breath, fragile and infinite. I could see Nolan beginning to retreat, the vulnerability in his expression starting to close off as self-preservation instincts kicked in. His grip on the hoodie loosened, and I watched him prepare to take it all back, to laugh it off as some kind of joke or misunderstanding that we could both pretend to believe. But I couldn't let him disappear behind that familiar mask of easy humor. Not when he'd just handed me the truth I'd been carrying alone for years. I moved without thinking, shifting closer on the couch until there was barely any space between us. Close enough to see the flecks of gold in his dark eyes. Close enough to count the individual raindrops still clinging to his hair. Close enough to reach out and touch the fabric he'd been clutching like a lifeline. My fingers brushed against his where they were tangled in the drawstrings, and I felt him go very still. The contact was electric, charged with all the careful distance we'd been maintaining, all the boundaries we'd been afraid to cross. When I spoke, my voice was quieter than I'd intended, rough with emotion I'd kept buried for too long. "You don't have to give it back," I whispered, my eyes never leaving his face. "But stop pretending it's just about the hoodie." The words hung in the air between us, an invitation and a challenge wrapped together. I watched them land, saw the moment when Nolan understood that I wasn't asking him to explain himself or justify his feelings. I was asking him to be brave enough to name them. His breath caught, barely audible, and for a heartbeat I thought he might pull away entirely. Might stand up and leave and pretend this conversation had never happened. But then something shifted in his expression, some internal wall crumbling under the weight of weeks of careful pretense. When he looked up at me, his eyes were bright with unshed tears, vulnerable in a way that made my chest ache. I'd seen Nolan cry before, over breakups and family troubles and movies with sad endings. But this was different. This was the kind of tears that came from finally being seen, from having your deepest truth acknowledged by the person who mattered most. "I know," he said, his voice breaking slightly on the words. "I like you, Eli." I didn't know how to say it without screwing everything up. The confession was simple, unadorned, but it hit me with the force of something I'd been waiting my entire adult life to hear. Not the elaborate declaration I might have imagined in my more romantic moments, but something honest and scared and absolutely perfect in its awkwardness. "I like you too," I said, the words feeling strange and wonderful in my mouth after years of keeping them locked away. "I've liked you for so long I forgot what it felt like not to." His smile, when it came, was tremulous and disbelieving, like he couldn't quite process that this was really happening. Like he'd prepared himself for rejection so thoroughly that acceptance felt impossible to absorb. "Really?" he asked, and there was something so young in the question, so hopeful and uncertain, that I felt my heart break open with tenderness for him. Instead of answering with words, I reached out and took his hand. Not the casual, friendly contact we'd shared countless times before, but something deliberate and intimate. His fingers were warm and slightly trembling, and when I laced them through mine, he squeezed back with a desperation that told me everything I needed to know about how long he'd been carrying this secret. We sat like that for a while, hands clasped between us, neither of us quite ready to move or speak, or do anything that might shatter the fragile new reality we'd created. The movie continued playing in the background, forgotten, while rain drummed against the windows and the lamplight painted everything in warm, golden tones. There was no kiss, not yet. No rush toward physical intimacy or grand romantic gestures. Just two people finally seeing each other without the careful barriers they'd constructed, finally brave enough to exist in the same emotional space without apology or pretense. I studied his face in the soft light, taking in details I'd noticed but never allowed myself to truly see. The way his eyelashes cast shadows on his cheekbones. The small scar near his left eyebrow from a childhood accident he'd told me about years ago. The way his lips curved when he was thinking, a habit I'd cataloged without meaning to over the course of our friendship. He was beautiful, had always been beautiful, but there was something different about him now. Something open and unguarded that made him seem more real, more present than he'd ever been before. Like all the careful distance he'd maintained, all the walls he'd built around his feelings had finally crumbled away. "How long?" I asked eventually, curious about the timeline of his feelings, about when friendship had started to blur into something more for him. He was quiet for a moment, considering, his thumb tracing absent patterns across my knuckles. "Since college, I think," he said finally. "Maybe earlier." I kept telling myself it was just friendship, just admiration for someone I respected. But then you'd smile at me in that way you do, or you'd fall asleep during movie nights, and I'd spend hours just watching you breathe, and I'd know it was more than that. The admission sent warmth flooding through my chest, the knowledge that we'd been carrying mirror feelings for each other all these years, both too afraid to risk the friendship we treasured. It felt like such a waste and such a gift at the same time. All those years of careful distance balanced against the sweetness of finally being here, finally honest. I told him about my own timeline then, about the quiet love I'd carried like a secret weight, about all the moments I'd nearly said something and lost my nerve. We compared notes like scientists documenting a phenomenon, mapping the geography of feelings we'd both been afraid to explore. The conversation felt like coming home to a place I'd never been before, familiar and startling all at once. And through it all, Nolan wore my hoodie like armor, like a promise, like the physical manifestation of everything we'd finally found the courage to say. 3 months later, I found myself watching Nolan make coffee in my kitchen, still wearing my hoodie as naturally as if it had always been his. The morning light caught in his hair the same way it had in that first photograph he'd sent me, but everything else had changed in ways both subtle and profound. The hoodie itself had evolved too, softened from constant wear and washing, stretched slightly at the cuffs where his hands had worried the fabric during late-night conversations and quiet moments of uncertainty. It had become a map of our relationship's geography, bearing witness to the careful transition from friendship to something deeper, more complex, more honest than either of us had dared to hope for. He moved through my space with an ease that still sometimes caught me off guard, opening cabinets he now knew by heart, reaching for mugs that had become as much his as mine. But it wasn't the casual familiarity of a frequent guest anymore. This was the comfort of someone who belonged here, who had earned his place through patient negotiation and gentle integration rather than assumption or demand. The weeks following our confession had been a masterclass in careful navigation. We'd approached this new version of ourselves with the same thoughtfulness we'd brought to our friendship, testing boundaries and establishing rhythms that honored both what we'd been and what we were becoming. There had been awkward moments, certainly, times when the weight of changed expectations felt heavier than the comfortable ambiguity we'd left behind. But there had been revelations too, small discoveries that felt like gifts. The way Nolan's hand fit perfectly in mine when we walked down the street. Fingers interlaced with the same naturalness that had always characterized our physical closeness. The way he kissed, soft and deliberate, like he was savoring something he'd imagined but never quite believed he'd be allowed to have. The way he looked at me now, without the careful guards he'd maintained for years, his feelings written plainly across his features. We still teased each other about the hoodie, but the dynamic had shifted into something playful rather than loaded with unspoken meaning. I'd joke about never getting it back, threatening to charge him rent or demanding visiting rights. He'd respond that he'd earned it through years of patient friendship, that it was payment for all the times he'd listened to me worry about deadlines, or helped me move furniture, or talked me through creative blocks that felt insurmountable. But the truth was, I never wanted it back. Seeing him where it had become one of my favorite things, a visual reminder of the courage it had taken for both of us to step into this new version of ourselves. It was proof that love could grow quietly in the spaces between words, that the most important transformations often happen slowly, imperceptibly, until one day you looked up and realized everything had changed. The apartment itself felt different now too, charged with a domesticity that was both foreign and familiar. Nolan's books had begun appearing on my shelves, his preferred brand of coffee in my kitchen, his jacket hanging beside mine on the hook by the door. These small integrations had happened organically, without discussion or negotiation, the natural result of two lives beginning to merge in the careful way that felt sustainable rather than overwhelming. Our friends had noticed the change, of course, though most had been too polite to comment directly. There had been knowing glances and raised eyebrows, the kind of looks that suggested people had been waiting for this development longer than either of us had realized. Sarah, Nolan's ex from college, had laughed when she saw us together at a mutual friend's birthday party, shaking her head with fond exasperation. Finally, she'd said, as if our relationship had been inevitable rather than the terrifying leap of faith it had felt like from the inside. Now, watching him move through my morning routine as if he'd always been part of it, I felt the deep satisfaction of a decision that had proven itself wise through daily repetition. This was what I'd been afraid to want, what I'd convinced myself was impossible. Not just the dramatic confession or the romantic resolution, but the quiet aftermath, the gentle reshaping of ordinary moments around the presence of someone who saw you completely and chose to stay. Nolan caught me watching him and smiled, that crooked grin I'd loved for years but could now acknowledge openly. The hoodie sleeves were pushed up to his elbows as he worked, revealing the strong forearms I'd admired from a careful distance for so long. When he finished with the coffee, he brought me a mug prepared exactly the way I liked it. A small intimacy that spoke to how closely he'd been paying attention all these years. "Thank you," I said, accepting both the coffee and the soft kiss he pressed to my temple. Gestures so natural, they felt like muscle memory rather than conscious choice. He settled beside me on the couch, close enough that our thighs touched, close enough that I could smell my own laundry detergent mixed with his skin, a scent that had become as familiar as my own breathing. The morning stretched ahead of us, unhurried and comfortable, full of the small rituals we'd developed together. Later, we'd probably argue about what to watch on television, or whose turn it was to do the dishes, or whether we needed groceries. Ordinary concerns of ordinary people who'd found each other and decided to build something together, one careful day at a time. But for now, we sat in comfortable silence, Nolan wearing my hoodie like a promise kept, both of us finally certain that some risks were worth taking, that some friendships were strong enough to survive the truth, that love could be both the scariest and safest thing in the world. The hoodie had become what it was always meant to be, not a symbol of longing or uncertainty, but simply a piece of clothing worn by someone I loved, in the home we'd begun to create together, on an ordinary morning that felt extraordinary only because we were finally, completely ourselves.